Hi everyone, a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Chris Borg, Policy Manager at NELC. It's my pleasure to be chairing today's online event on future planning, where next for the government's planning reforms. First, I'd like to quickly run through a few housekeeping announcements, some of which are shown on the slide on screen. Do use the Q&A function throughout the event to put questions to our speakers, and the chat function to interact with your fellow delegates and to share any information or links. That's part of what today's about. It's about sharing good practice. If you require any technical support, please do post in the chat, and my NELC colleague Courtney will try her best to help. Briefly, now on the closed caption feature, which is subtitles, they can be accessed by all of you at any time during today's event. And for desktop or laptop users, to turn on closed captions, please select Show Captions. The button will be labeled CC. And if the button is not visible, please select the three dots on the bottom right corner of the screen. Then select Captions, and after that you'll be prompted to show click Captions to please select that option. If you're using a mobile device or tablet, please scroll across the menu on the bottom of your screen and select Captions, and then you will be needing to click Show Captions. Okay, so that's subtitles dealt with. And again, if at any point during the event today you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please contact NELC support via the chat and we'll endeavour to rectify the issue for you. After the event, we'll be, hopefully this afternoon, we'll be sending out Jackie's presentation slides and any other links the speakers would like us to send out with the chat and the recording link. And we'll be inviting your feedback on today's event, so please do look out for the feedback form, which will hopefully pop up on your screens following the conclusion of the webinar. All delegates will be muted, as you've probably seen, so don't be surprised to see that, and that's on entry to the Zoom webinar platform. Okay, next slide, please. So moving on, NELC would like to thank its partners, Clear, Unity Trust Bank and CCLA for their extensive support for today's online event. Next speaker, please, Courtney. Thanks. Moving on to what today's theme is about. So the incoming government made it plain when coming into office in July 2024 that it wanted to build 1.5 million new homes during the course of the current Parliament, and that the Planning and Infrastructure Act, which has recently received royal assent, was designed to help ensure that happened. There have been rumours, in fact more than rumours, of yet more planning reforms in the pipeline, which is what our speakers are going to tell us about today. So have the government's plans on planning panned out? What will this all mean for parish and town councils? Has the government started to make inroads into delivering more housing nationally, or has development got out of control in the green belt? Today's dynamic online event, you'll gauge how the reforms from the Planning and Infrastructure Act will likely affect parish and town councils in your area, and find out real-time updates on any further planning reforms which may affect your own local council or local government more widely. Every size of parish and town council will hopefully gain something by attending today's online event. So, without further ado from me, I'm thrilled to be joined by a brilliant panel of speakers, who you can see on the screen. Jackie Copley, campaigns lead for the campaign to protect rural England. Rick Hebditch, convener at the Better Planning Coalition. And Robbie Calvert, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the Royal Town Planning Institute. Thanks, guys, for coming along. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jackie to kickstart proceedings. Over to you, Jackie.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And thank you for inviting CPRE to join the panel today. So yes, where next for the government and planning reforms? Next slide, please, Courtney. Just a little bit about CPRE. This year we're celebrating our 100th year anniversary, and during that time we've achieved a lot in terms of planning designations such as national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty and green belt. And we like to see ourselves as mediators of change. We stand up for the countryside, championing what's good about the countryside and making sure when decisions come forward, rural communities and rural areas are considered properly. And we promote solutions for positive change. We're not about stopping new development. We need our needs provided for, but we'd like it to be done in a way in which people are considered, our natural environment is considered, because obviously we're living in a period of biodiversity decline, and we want evidence to help underpin decisions that occur. And we like to share what's possible. So where we come across good examples of either community-led development or where town and parish councils have done some really interesting work, whether it be on housing or renewables, we like to share that. And essentially, we're building a movement of people, whether it be at the national level, right the way down to the local level. So local voices can be heard right the way from how the rules are made nationally, right the way down to decisions on the ground, and encouraging people to get involved with things like hedge laying, meadow creations, and that type of thing. Next slide, please. So, in overview, we're obviously living in a period of fast change. We have devolution reforms and we've had big changes to planning. We had the Planning and Infrastructure Bill last year, which became an act in December 2025. And stemming from that are changes to the National Planning Policy Framework. And that's the document that sets the rules for how spatial plans at the combined authority, regional authority level come forward, and also local plans. And those in terms impact neighbourhood plans that town and parish councils may be involved in delivering. And yeah, it's all to do with trying to achieve more benefits from finite land and still retaining local decision making. So, at all of the levels of spatial planning, we call for a brownfield first approach. We want it to be community centred, and we want, to look after people and planet as developers plan for new development. Next slide, please. So this is the next few slides are looking specifically at the changes coming forward in the consultation draft of the NPPF. For the first time, national development management policies are going to be introduced. CPRE had really opposed their introduction because we liked local planning policies to be decided at the local level. Um, that said, some local plans don't really have policies relating to clean energy, or are ambitious enough in terms of nature recovery. So, given that they are going to be introduced, we're working with government to try and get the best text to allow local areas to be planned properly, and get that balance for the NPPF in terms of economic, social, and environment. Now, a new tier of planning is coming in, spatial development strategies. They're going to be plans that are have a life of 20 years, and we're keen to make sure that enough social housing and affordable housing comes forward. And the same is true for local plans that are at the local authority tier. They have a minimum period of 15 years, but the NPPF sets out how those plans should come forward. And again, it looks at evidence. It must be proportionate. It must use plain language and have transparency. And those are the principles we're seeking. And a lot of the plan making policies do actually adhere to that. The government is very keen on more strategic planning so we can have more consensus. People understand what the policy context is. Next slide, please. So equally, there's going to be a new tier of decision-making policies. The NPPF is going to try to remove duplication at the local plan level by having it quite clear what information is required for applications, for developer contributions, and on viability, and issues relating to enforcement. So unauthorised development, there should be more teeth in the text of the NPPF to stop unauthorised development and take a stricter line on it. Next slide, please. Again, sustainable development is at the heart of what we do, and there are new policies in the proposed NPPF on spatial planning, and also on the presumption of favour of sustainable development. And I set out in this slide, these will get shared later, but we support some of them, such as S1 and S2, but there are concerns about there's a S5 policy that looks at development outside of settlements, and we have put in a response to government showing why that could be problematic because it might actually reduce powers to stop speculative development outside settlement boundaries, and we're concerned about that, particularly because it's linked to housing numbers. And if local authorities can't demonstrate they've delivered enough housing, which is very difficult at the moment, we could see an explosion of development outside of settlements. Next slide, please. So our overarching system recommendations are we want planning to restore a genuinely plan-led system, and that means developers should be building out in accordance with the policies and the allocations, having a brownfield first binding principle, having climate alignment, so the necessary work is done for climate resilience, adaptations, that we have a genuine infrastructure first. If we don't get the right infrastructure, such as a sustainable transport, public transport, and the ability to use bikes and walk places, we're just building in car dominance, and that's clearly problematic. So we need to have infrastructure, including clean energy as well. And then we also want strengthened public trust when outcomes occur on the ground that aren't anticipated or against the public expectation. That's where you get a lack of trust. So we want that to be reversed, and we want people to be able to trust the system. Next slide, please. So yeah, CPRE and NAL, we are natural allies. Town and parish councils, like CPRE, want to see the best for their local communities, and we often share a similar voice when it comes to planning matters. We support people power, local groups being able to inform what happens, being able to respond to evidence and say, hang on, that's not our experience of this local area. We know this, that, and the other, and for that to be included because it is of value. But equally, there needs to be management of expectations that new development will come forward, and let's try and ensure it comes forward in a way which is beneficial to more groups of people. And then our theory of change is it's all about outcomes. How can we achieve better outcomes on the ground? Doing what's right in terms of people and place. So I think that's it. I don't think I've got another slide. But if you want to get in contact, so yeah, CPRE will continue to work for reforms that allow for a thriving and beautiful countryside for the benefit of all in the future. So if you'd like to contact me, you can get me at info@CPRE. But obviously, I'm here to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Jackie. That's fantastic. Thanks for that a very thorough expose of the NPPF and also CPRE's take on that. We fully agree. A lot of CPRE members are also NALP members, and we want to keep that partnership going. Long into the future, recognizing that most parish councils are in rural areas. That's the reality. Now over to yourself, Rick. Give way to yourself there from the Better Planning Coalition, and a synoptic view of your members' views on the NPPF and the Act recently. Over to you, Rick.
So much. Thank you for inviting me. So just tell you a bit about the Better Planning Coalition. We're a coalition of around 45 organisations. So NALC and CPRE are members, and RTPI are also on our steering group as well. So we work closely with those organisations. We have a membership that's sort of not-for-profit organisations, so concerned with the planning system in the public interest. So particularly kind of social and environmental issues. I'm the filling in the sandwich between two chartered planners, so I'll be talking less about the detail of the NPPF and legislation, but more around kind of where are the areas of controversy going forward. So I was going to start just with the Planning and Infrastructure Act that was, as Chris said, had royal assent earlier this year. So just covering sort of three issues within that in terms of its implementation. The first of which I think is the national scheme of delegation. So these are new regulations that say how or what decisions can go to a planning committee and what will be decided by officers. So the central government will set regulations rather than councils themselves deciding. So there was a consultation on the new regulations a few months ago. The regulations themselves have to be approved by both houses of parliament, so there's a chance to kind of raise that. I think the worry that we have is around kind of locking people out of being able to have their voice heard in planning decisions, because if you're not going to committee, they're being behind closed doors with officers. So that's an area where I think people will start to notice that the kind of the changes that there will be. So we will continue to make the case for trying to kind of widen the ability to take things to planning committees as well. The second area, as Jackie talked about, was spatial development strategies that are coming in. So we're expecting the guidance from government quite soon on that. And they are described a bit in the National Planning Policy Framework, the draft NPPF that was published right at the end of last year as well. So again, there are three particular things that we want to see in that. So one of the things is the description of them in the National Planning Policy Framework is missing out on some of the important things that are supposed to be features of them in the Planning and Infrastructure Act. So one of them is around climate change, both kind of mitigation, reducing emissions, but also adaptation. How do we adapt to a changing climate as well? They are long-term documents, so they need to take account of the fact that we're going to have to change many things in society as we deal with climate change, both kind of cutting emissions and then again adaptation to it as well. So they will last up to 2050 when the UK is due to reach its net zero target. And just to confirm, I haven't got slides. I'm just talking from my notes as well, just for people. And then the third thing that we'd like to see a stronger link with for STSs, for spatial development strategies, is linking to the new land use framework as well that was published by DEFRA a couple of months ago. So the two should be in sync rather than having sort of competing strategies frameworks. So you've got the land use framework that's DEFRA, you've got the National Planning Policy Framework that is MHCLG, and then the Treasury also have a kind of competing framework as well, which is around infrastructure and a kind of toolkits around developing infrastructure. So those three things need to kind of come together much more as well in spatial development strategies. The final thing in terms of the Planning Infrastructure Act is we are now seeing the implementation of some of the measures on infrastructure. So the area that we were most concerned about with the Planning Infrastructure Act was the removal of statutory obligations around consulting communities at the pre-application stage for major infrastructure. So we're quite worried about the extent to which we're going to be shutting communities out from that process. We hope to see some measure in terms of the guidance around trying to consult with communities before you put into an application into the formal NSIP, Nationally Significant Infrastructure Projects process. There's an awful lot of infrastructure coming through in the next few years. So I was looking at this is the Planning Inspectorate's update. They publish every couple of months. So we've got 88 schemes at either the pre-application stage or in the formal process. And of those in the formal process, 2/3 of them are energy schemes, and that's likely to be what we're going to see in the next few years going forward, even beyond 2030 as well. So those are schemes around new power lines, new grid, but also generating as well, so renewables in particular, and many controversial schemes around kind of large solar schemes as well. I was just going to quickly touch on the NPPF as well, which Jackie talked about in more detail. So I think one of the things that will be apparent is when we have the new draft NPPF coming into practice, unless there are changes, is around the sort of further tilting the balance in favour of development. So the government is changing the presumption in favour of development so that it permanently applies. So previously, if you didn't have a local plan, then the NPPF presumption in favour of development would apply. Now it applies permanently. So it applies within settlements. You should give approval. Outside settlements, the presumption is you shouldn't, except for certain classes, but those classes are very broad. And one of the classes for allowing development is if you can't show a 5-year supply of land for housing, or if you're not meeting the housing delivery test. Now, that's most of the local authorities in the country, so just over half of them can't do that. So the presumption will apply still, and it'll apply permanently. And only limited policies can override that presumption as well. So that's an area where we're particularly worried about that. I think the other thing that will be controversial is that the new NPPF will override local plans much more as well. So there are restrictions on having policies that run kind of that are different to the NPPF as well. Even if you can have a good justification for them, you can't have those. And also restrictions on local quantitative standards, so around energy efficiency or biodiversity net gain. You can't vary those from what's in the NPPF as well. And I think that's going to be quite controversial. I think it's also the background of what's happening in the housing market as well. So housing supply is not increasing. Government policy is to increase the supply of land for housing, but because of the weakness of the economy, because of the rising costs of building housing, both kind of inflation costs, but also the costs of regulation and tax on developers as well, it's becoming less profitable to build. So the big volume house builders are scaling back their plans. They're buying less land, they're planning less development. And I saw something from the Construction Products Association, I think it was, expecting a 7% decline in house building this year, in private house building. So the consequence of that is likely to be more, if you've got more land for housing, but you're going to build less housing, it gives developers more choice around where they're going to build. So they're likely to build, I would suggest, on greenfield sites, and also in the land that's being released in the Greenbelt as well. So the new NPPF takes a further chunk, if you like, out of the Greenbelt. So we've had the grey belt policy from the last NPPF in 2024. This new NPPF, if it goes through as is, will also allow for developments around stations, and there's also a greater encouragement to through spatial development strategies and local plans to release more land to take it out of the green belt as well, if you can't demonstrate that you're going to meet housing need as specified by the government. Finally, just to touch on the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act, which had royal assent in the last couple of days of the last parliamentary session. So this sets up strategic authorities, as you probably know. So kind of like not the old kind of regional government, but a kind of like a larger scale than the local authorities at the moment. Helpfully in that, as a result of lobbying by CPRE, RTPI, ourselves and others, it has now got a competency for the new strategic authorities on rural affairs. So that's quite helpful. There's also a requirement for the government to publish regulations around brownfield first policy as well as a result of the Act. So those are two helpful changes that we and others kind of try to push for. And then the last thing is just today, we've got King's Speech. So I was having a quick look on my phone as Jackie was talking. So there is measures to take forward the review of nuclear to make nuclear a bit easier. The government hasn't gone for the full set of recommendations proposed by John Fingleton in his review. We had concerns around weakening the status of national parks and national landscapes that he recommended. It's a more sensible response, I think, from government, but we need to check the details. So we'll be having a look at that. There is also a strengthened growth duty for regulators. So regulators will have to even more strongly promote economic growth. So that would apply to things like people like the organisations like the Environment Agency and Natural England, and potentially, I guess, Historic England as well. So there would be concerns about how that might kind of fit with their statutory purposes to safeguard nature or heritage. So we need to have a look at the detail of those things as well. And then I think it's also interesting that we may well have a leadership contest for the next Prime Minister in the next couple of days, perhaps. So we might see how different potential leaders promote their idea on housing and development. So we've had a very sort of YIMBY-ish, very kind of build approach from the government overall on housing and development. We'll see if that changes or not. And we're likely to see lots of kind of competing ideas from different factions of the Labour Party, different think tanks trying to influence that leadership contest if it takes place. So those are the areas that I thought I wanted to just cover as potentially ones where we're likely to see controversy continue going forward still in the planning system over the next few months and years. Thank you.
Brilliant. And you can't get much more current than the King's Speech. So thanks very much indeed, Rick. That's really, really great. Yeah, we've also been analysing that for planning other issues of import to parish and town councils. A really, really good summary there of both the NPPF and also the Planning and Infrastructure Act and general, kind of holistic implications for parish and town councils. Often difficult to unpick, aren't they, really? And especially given the length of the NPPF update, as Jackie and yourself have said, Rick. Brilliant. Thank you so much. And some really good questions triggered by both Jackie's and Rick's excellent presentations to ask later. Next up, it's Robbie Calvert, Head of Public Affairs and Planning Policy at RTPI. Over to you, Rick. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, everyone. Really enjoyed the first two presentations. Thanks to NALC for having me here. But yeah, I thought Jackie and Rick were brilliant. Really good, neat summaries of what's been going on. And it's been a very exciting couple of years in planning reform, of course, sort of culminating in the publication of the draft MPPF in December last year, representing another sort of significant milestone in this journey, and expecting a final form of that at some point in the summer, possibly before recess. So now I think as an industry as a whole, as a sector, we're both expecting but hoping for a bit of stability. And I think that's certainly acknowledging what could be a tricky transition period, and I'll come back to that. But I think we need to allow some time now to bed in these reforms. And I guess that's notwithstanding any sort of political turmoil and, of course, the contents of the King's speech. Particularly impressed with Rick's live update as I have my officers scurrying away looking at the content of that. But I don't think anything dramatic for planning in there at the moment. So we welcome that. Just quickly, for those who are not aware of the Royal Town Planning Institute, we are a membership body for town planners across the UK and globally. We champion the art and the science of town planning. In England, we have approximately 22,000 members, and importantly, they sit both across the private and the public sector, which can make my life difficult when I'm doing consultation responses. But we have a very unique view on the planning system as a result of that, and we tend to seek what is good for the planning system as a whole. As a result of our broad membership. So delving in a little bit to the MPPF, in terms of a top note from us, from our pretty significant consultation exercise that we did through January, is that the general travel of direction was welcome generally by our membership. And then thematically looking at what came through, it certainly, as both Jackie and Rick picked up on, this kind of trend towards more nationally consistent approaches to planning. So yes, that's the national decision-making policy, but there's other bits trailed within that draft MPPF that are still to be worked on. So, for example, the introduction of a national validation list. This is an approach already taken in Northern Ireland. Further standardisation around national model planning conditions and obligations, alongside the introduction of Section 106 developer contribution templates for medium-sized sites. So I think when you look at that in the round, this is the general travel direction government we're wanting to go in. And I think generally a degree more of standardisation was welcomed, but I think really picking up on the point I think both Rick and Jackie touched on is that kind of limiting that local ability to be more ambitious around, for example, energy efficiency standards and biodiversity net gain. And as you'd expect, that very much did split our membership. I think in terms of the Institute's view on that, I think ultimately it really hinges then on what is set nationally. So are the national standards that will replace these local standards ambitious enough to meet both nature and climate emergencies? So that's the question we put back to the government there, if you are following this path. And of course, the government's growth agenda, runs all the way through it. And I think there's that particular emphasis on providing support for SME builders, set throughout with a sort of package of proposals. So yeah, looking at the draft, things we liked. Well, firstly was the inclusion of wording relating to a purpose of planning. This is actually a piece of work that we very actively campaigned and lobbied on through the Planning and Infrastructure Act's parliamentary passage, was for the inclusion of a purpose of planning. And this is something, this has been a long-term RTPI ask, and one which we've successfully promoted into, for example, in Scotland in the Planning Act 2019. And the wording is similar to what we see in the MPPF, and that is the purpose of planning. The purpose of the planning system is to contribute to the achievement of sustainable development by managing the use and development of land in the long-term public interest. So we're delighted to see that there. Great to have it. Doesn't mean it's an easy thing to do. What is the long-term public interest? Could certainly exercise us at a local and even a national level too. But we feel that's the right framing for planning decisions to occur. So great to see that come through. I guess one of our key themes looking through this whole document, and it is an amazing piece of work and a lot of thought has gone into it. And I think one of the things that our members really wanted was more clarity, more consistency. And noting this and the kind of, so that led to a lot of nitpicks, if I'm honest, in our response, and it was a lengthy one at that, I think 116 pages. And I don't think I'm alone here to say this is one of the more significant tasks that I've undertaken in my professional life in terms of responding to this. I had very little thoughts left about society or anything by the time I was done writing it, and huge contribution from our members there too. But it really exercised both our committees and us as a team. And I think when you take all these kind of nitpicks that we had, and we will look at more thematic issues that we raised throughout the response. But I think when you take that, the cumulative impact of all these nitpicks could be quite significant. And we're about designing something that ultimately is going to be workable for our members on a daily basis. And you know, I think sometimes it's unfair to ask for more clarity and consistency, because can that ever be truly achieved in this complicated and ever-changing world? And like I say, it's about us creating something workable. And I think we've got to be really clear here now, and I'll ban myself from saying it in any response, is asking for something to be more certain and more flexible, because they diametrically oppose one another in many situations. And often it's about achieving a balance and achieving something that's going to deliver on the outcomes that are intended. And that was one of our asks. I think in a similar note around clarification was delineation. And with the NDM, the National Decision-Making Policy is now in place. Government's firmly sort of put itself in a fuller position now for local decision making, clearly, and so that need for clarity and workability and the stress testing of policies so that development management planners can apply them with confidence is very, very important. And that's sometimes quite difficult for central government because they've not been working in development management necessarily for a while. So really making sure that we got that local authority feed in around how the actual wording works. And in some occasions, that's simply adding an and or an or to a policy, Roman numerals, so it can be applied in a considered manner. And noting as well, usefully, Scotland's already taken this approach. So we did work with colleagues up there to ensure to look at how that's happened over time as well. Is there any lessons that can be learned? And yeah, so I think throughout the piece, it was about that clarity and that delineation. I think that's particularly relevant in regards to the new plan-led system. So as both Jackie and Rick touched on, we now have the reintroduction of sub-regional planning through spatial development strategies, of course, a new local plan system, which is very ambitious in its 30-month time frame, and of course, neighbourhood plans too. And I think when reading through the document, I often referred to the development plan, which is all of them. But then reading into the policy requirements underneath that, it was very unclear at what spatial level, what kind of information should be dealt with. So often we would see that the policy itself would be requiring far too much detail from a spatial development strategy, which are themselves to be high level and strategic, and then actually requiring sort of representing far too much of a resource burden for a neighbourhood plan at that local level to meaningfully carry that through. So I think that's one theme throughout that is us saying we need to be clear about what element of spatial planning is dealt with by which part of this policy. And indeed, part of that is making sure we have this kind of golden thread, I think, running through. So from that spatial development strategy into the local plans, through the neighbourhood plans, and into that decision-making policy as well. So really making sure that they're joined up across the board there. And that was quite a complex job. That required the team having to do a lot of cross-referencing of all the different elements, making sure they're workable and also cohesive when they're read as a whole. And that's sometimes a little difficult because you do see certain government departments really leading on certain chapters, but then not necessarily having that sort of cohesion, that oversight in terms of the editorial approach to support decision makers. As I touched on previously, transition arrangements were something of great concern to us. You know, such a radical reworking of national policy with many other moving parts going on, not least local government reform. I know both Rick and Jackie touched on the Devolution Act happening alongside this. This is very, very ambitious. And I would argue beyond the 1.5 million target that government have for housing, I think that the targets around having local government reform wrapped up by 2028, having our spatial development strategies in place by the end of this parliamentary term are just, if not more ambitious than that 1.5 million target, and are happening alongside that. So we have advocated for a bit more considered approach of this transition. So it's considered, it's managed. And in particular, a lot of that hinged around local plans that are in a late stage of preparation at the moment. We don't want them to get penalised by not being able to be examined in a kind of hybrid manner. So that conflicts between the new framework as it emerges and the late stage local plans are dealt with through examination, not dealt with at an application by application basis, which is currently how it will run. I think our other concern there is about the imminent removal of supplementary planning documents, which allow local authorities a little bit of flexibility when they're dealing with planning policy matters or major development sites. So not being able to have that and then waiting on an adopted local plan to come through before supplementary plans can therefore be prepared and move through examination could lead to a little bit of a gap here, and could be very resource intensive for our local plan teams as they try and adjust to this. And I think around that, we have asked government for a support package, both financial stimulus in particular for local plan teams, really welcoming some of the provisions in the Planning Infrastructure Act about reinvesting planning fee income, but note that that's very much targeted at development management teams, and we still only have a third of adopted and up-to-date plans in England, and it's going to take a while to turn around that boat. But we think essentially held resource stimulus package needs to be in place to support local plan teams in particular, but also around a skills program as well, as we adjust to a number of new policies that have come through in the Act. Just take one, for example, wildfires. There's a lot of planning implications as a result of wildfires, and it's increasingly a problem. So even though you could read that as a more minor part of the framework, actually its novelty is going to create a lot of resource consideration for our planning teams. Just the final theme was around infrastructure. There is a lot more going on in the draft NPPF around infrastructure. And this will really be supported by the introduction of spatial development strategies and their sort of key remit of identifying strategic infrastructure requirement, especially the sort of fuller consideration around the role of water and electricity grid infrastructure in development. We really welcome this part of the framework. In fact, and what our members wanted to see is more. We actually urge the government to go further in this regards. And I think that's to firmly recognise the sort of fundamental coordinating instrument and regulatory catalyst that the planning system can be for infrastructure delivery. And in fact, that's where the big wins will be going forward into the future, not policies around train stations or loosening of the green belt. It's actually in that strategic infrastructure coordination where we'll bring forward the growth that we need, with the right infrastructure in place in the right places too. I think putting all of this together, a sort of key meta point from ours, and one of our concerns, I guess, around the draft framework as proposed, was that it wouldn't maybe necessarily be expressed evenly across regions. And that speaks to, for example, the train station policy, so the slightly more permissive approach to development around train stations being only in areas of high existing productivity, but also acknowledging everything else that's going on in the reform ecosystem, local government reform, spatial development strategies. So spatial development strategies in areas that are already running ahead with them, let's say Liverpool City region, Northeast, or now emerging in areas that haven't done sub-regional planning for a very long time and maybe undergoing local government reform. So I think putting all that together is, if we're not careful and this is not done in a managed way, this could exacerbate existing regional inequality. And that's, of course, something we wouldn't want to see. So just wrapping up, hope I haven't gone too far over time. But as I say, in terms of the English planning system, we are looking forward to a period of stability, delivery, implementation, bedding in, acknowledging that there could be an awkward transition period now over the next couple of years. And in fact, I think a lot of the big wins won't be seen in this parliamentary term and would be into another parliamentary term. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And of course we should. We should have a long-term vision for this country, and planning is the means by which we provide that. really agreeing with Rick's point on the macroeconomic issues. And I think ultimately and collectively in the built environment, we are hopefully now starting to move away from seeing the planning system as the key blocker to development. Planning is about getting the right development in the right place. But also you can't live in a planning consent too. So yes, we need to look at how the regulators are working. We need to look at demand side issues. Clearly, we've got a big problem with inflation at the moment. So I hope government attention moves away from planning as we let it bed in, and just to ensure that it is resourced effectively to do its job and have that strategic coordinating role, which could really bring forward growth into the future for this country. So thank you. That's it for me.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Robbie. That was fantastic. And huge thanks to all our speakers, Rick as well as Jack. It's a really holistic, really kind of in-depth analysis of the NPPF and also the implications generally for local government and parishes from the Planning and Infrastructure Act. And more to come, as you said just then, Robbie. Just when it seems we've turned the corner on one big consultation or document, another one comes out, and it's no surprise that you're saying, because it's my view, been my view here at 20 years at NELC, that actually a lot of these meta issues do converge, and you do wonder what if there is any ever cessation to the state of flux between these meta issues like planning and local government reform, because they do affect each other, don't they? So thanks for that. And look, just also to thank all of our brilliant delegates. There's some fantastic questions been posted in, more than I think I've ever seen at an online event, and I'm not just saying that. I've had to be really, really quite picky at this end as to which ones I'm going to ask, but we've got loads. And I've tried to go for the ones here which are kind of like the most generally applicable, which all of our speakers can have a stab at answering, avoiding kind of like statements, and then also those aimed at specific speakers. So the first one I'm going to ask is, we're going to ask two that have been asked by Debbie Harding, which are very good questions. I'm going to aim this one first at yourself, Jackie, because you spoke first. And Debbie's first question, I believe, asks, is the national delegation scheme decided or still subject to further consultation? I think, Rick and Robbie probably touched on this more, but planning officers, Debbie says, appear to be less experienced at a time when delegation powers are increasing. Well, that's something I think Nelt would agree with. Also, the negotiations will be behind closed doors, which is not very transparent. Any comments on that, Jackie, before I open that then up to Robbie and Rick?
I might actually have to defer the question on delegation to Rick in terms of whether it's still out for consultation. I don't believe it is. I think the window has closed in terms of consultation, and I actually think that might have been referred to in the King's speech today. Clearly, it's important to get the right level of expertise governing. So quite a lot of decisions in local authorities will be retained by the officer. Less decisions will go forward to committees, and less will be called. Well, it'll be interesting to see. I think the principle is less decisions will be called in by Secretary of State, whether that be for development for homes or business, or if it's energy related, being called in by Secretary of State for energy. But yeah, we obviously want there to be local feedback. But in terms of the window for change, I'm afraid I'm going to have to defer to either Robbie or Richard on that.
Yeah, it's worth saying, I think from our end, NELC has responded to a kind of a plethora of planning consultations. There's no doubt you have, Robbie, as well recently. Planning fees, planning decisions, planning committees, and I think we've probably shared our drafts with you guys, emanating from the Planning and Infrastructure Act, getting royal assent. And yeah, I think the window for the actual consultation has closed. I guess what Debbie's aiming at here is, Rick, unless you know differently, whether or not the government has made it, has a further window of time in which it's going to make decisions based on that now closed consultation, the planning committee's one, or whether that's it. I guess it will need to respond, won't it, to that consultation in due course, Rick?
So from memory, the consultation has happened and it's closed, and the government's considering its response to the consultation. When it does publish the regulations for the National Scheme of Delegation, then there is normally most regulations, most statutory instruments just go through on the nod in Parliament. But there was a requirement in the Planning Infrastructure Act that they would need to put them to both houses of Parliament, and they would go to a vote. It's incredibly unlikely that that will change anything, but it is a chance to raise concerns about the process. I'm trying to remember something else on the national scheme of litigation. Yeah, so I think it is a worry that what will be able still to go to planning committees. So there's only certain matters that will be allowed to go to planning committees, and it will require the chief planner or equivalent in a local planning authority and the chair of the planning committee to agree on taking things to a planning committee. So that is where I think it stands at the moment. But Robbie may have more to say on that as well.
Yeah,
thanks.
That's absolutely my understanding, Rick. Yeah, I mean, I think starting with the schemes of delegation, the naming of a chief planning officer or equivalent is very much brought on one of our key legislative asks through the Planning and Infrastructure Act is for the chief planning officers to be a statutory function in local authorities. This introduces a really key and potentially controversial element now of the planning system. We want that undertaken by competent professionals who are in accordance with our code of conduct, which I believe is appeared in the chat already. And I think likewise with those planning officers undertaking the decision making or an enhanced role in that scheme of delegation, we want to see competent professionals doing that. Chartership of the RTPI is the route to doing that. Of course, I would say that, but I do genuinely believe it as well. I think touching on just quickly the comment around planning offers and experience, I think that's a really interesting point. Just as a sort of side note, it is something in terms of the wider planning industry, in particular senior planners and principal planners, there is a bit of a dearth of them at the moment. So when we look at our future workforce, actually those experienced local authority planners are this kind of insufficient in terms of their provision right now. And I think that's a job for us and then the wider sector to ensure not only we have a strong pipeline of planners coming into the industry, but we're also building up their careers in a fast and robust manner. So succession planning, career development, mentoring, all very, very critical so we can sort of fill that gap. And I think in a similar note as well, looking at the age profiles of local authorities, a lot of local authority planning teams, our age profile is skewed older. So a big concern for us over the next 10, 15 years, if we have a mass retirement event, how do we capture that knowledge? How do we build up that next generation of leaders? So we've asked for government for a comprehensive skills and workforce strategy. So they look at everything in the realm of pipeline, mid-career and into retirement as well. How can we stop our planners leaving the industry so soon?
Completely agree with everything you've all said, and yourself lastly there, Robbie. Now argued in its response to the MHCLG planning fees consultation recently that it was right in principle that planning fees went up, not disproportionately, but not least because we want LPAs to have more planning resource to enforce planning decisions and also to make sure that communities still have a resource planning system, a democratic planning system, and that's been long our position, which we shared with you guys at RTPI. Listen, let's move on. We try to allocate a lot more time today, if we could, to Q&A. But how can we follow those brilliant three presentations? Debbie Harding, I'm asking this question because it's right next to Debbie's first question. On the Q&A chat, and there were nearly 40 questions on this. I'm trying not to lose my place desperately here, so do forgive me. Debbie asks, what is the role of neighbourhood plans? And I don't think that's a rhetorical question. I think that's meant, what is the current role of neighbourhood plans now that the Planning and Infrastructure Act has got royal assent, now that the funding has been entirely scrapped and that the locality neighbourhood planning team has been wiped out, and now that all of the locality neighbourhood planning materials have been migrated to the MHCLG website. So I think that's, so what is the current, I'm going to insert, Debbie, if you forgive me, what is the current role of neighbourhood plans, post all of that in square brackets, and I'm going to lob that question at yourself, Rick, to answer first, if you're okay, please.
So to be honest, this is an area that I know least about. But so I will very quickly hand over to Robbie or Jackie. I think, as far as I'm aware, it's exactly the same. The neighbourhood plans in the planning system have not changed. The resourcing obviously has changed, but the NPPF still includes neighbourhood plans. They are the development plan for their neighbourhood, so that hasn't changed. But Robbie and Jackie are, I'm sure, will have more to say on it than me.
Yeah, and just to interpose, I think we had a meeting of the NELT Policy Committee yesterday. This came up, and we're looking to try and do a kind of national survey on this. Via our county associations. I think the aim of it, in due course, there's no timescale attached to this, yes, but to ascertain how many of the 3,000 parish-led neighbourhood plans, how many of them are intending to or trying to refresh or remake their neighbourhood plans, that have already got them. Given the lack of funding. So a bit of a state of the nation kind of. So it's a really key thing for now. Robbie, any comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, around neighbourhood planning, certainly looking at the draft NPPF, I think quite considerable weight is given to neighbourhood plans, and I think the neighbourhood planning sector kind of welcomed that element. There is that provision though around containing the allocations to meet identified housing requirements now. So whether that's setting a sort of higher bar. I think back to that point that I was making about a lot of references to the development plan throughout the whole framework. And if you read that with the view to just preparing a neighbourhood plan, it being an extremely complex matter. So we'll see what comes out in the final framework and whether there's some kind of delineation and more clarity there over which plans have to do what comes forward. So let's wait to see the final wording. But yeah, quite a strong policy weight behind neighbourhood plans. I believe, in fact, we had to pick up government that at points they were given more weight than local plans, which we felt was probably disproportionate and equal weighting should be attributed. So maybe that's an editing issue. So let's see what happens. I think around the removal of funding, yeah, I mean, that's extremely concerning. Obviously, we don't want to see neighbourhood plans just come forward in areas where the community has enough sort of existing resource to make them come forward. So more wealthy, affluent rural areas, I would expect in that scenario. And certainly want to see community-led planning come through across the board, and in particular in areas dealing with deprivation. I think we need to also join up quite a lot of what we're doing around community-led engagement. So just to think about, for example, some of the Pride in Place work and the neighbourhood boards there. What role do they have with neighbourhood plans or local plans or the planning system at all? And there's a huge amount of funding flowing into areas which don't have local plans adopted or up to date anyway. So how are we going to make a better connection with some of our significant regeneration efforts and engaging the community with that? And I think similar into the Devolution Act as well, it's the neighbourhood governance structures that have been identified there. It's just kind of enabling provisions at the moment. So let's have a little bit more detail about what they look like, but also how they engage with the plan system too. So I would encourage delegates to look beyond even purely what we see in the NPPF to the wider array of government initiatives around community-led matters. And let's try and get these lined up. Let's maximise and make our efforts efficient and impactful.
Completely agree. I think you mentioned 2 points there. An expansion of community-led planning, i.e. potentially through the parish planning process, which picks up social, economic and environmental sustainability issues, which neighbourhood planning to an extent has done. We're expecting to see an expansion of that, which was probably the case pre-2011 when the Localism Act introduced neighbourhood planning in the first place. Certainly, I noticed that. We've got an online event on that deliberately for later this year, but we've also got an online event in December on neighbourhood planning to find out, what's the state of play, where is that, at that point. Completely agree with you. Jackie, any rural?
Yeah, just to say, CPRE were an advocate of neighbourhood plans because it was a way of local communities being able to express what was of value in their local area and where there were opportunities for development so they could play their part. Clearly, it's of concern the funding's gone, but if you do look at the NPPF text that was consulted on, it definitely has PM5. It's a plan making policy for neighbourhood plans, so they're still part of the system. If they're made, as Robbie says, they carry a lot of weight. I've only seen one case where a decision was made against a neighbourhood plan. I'm sure there are others, but on the whole, they lift a lot of policy weight. So I would stay with them. And I noticed in the chat someone said 13,000. That's quite reasonable for a neighbourhood plan. Um, but again, it comes to the proportionate evidence. You'll have evidence in front of you. I think get them together as quickly as you can and keep the vision, the issues. The government's expecting strategic development strategies and local plans to be pulled together in a quicker time frame, and I can't see why neighbourhood plans shouldn't be able to also be promoted at a quicker time scale, so long as there's engagement with the community as wide a stakeholder as is possible in local areas to avoid conflicts. But yeah, stay in there and keep with them for now.
You completely concur with that, absolutely. And I think, one thing that now CAS being considered about is trying to avoid a kind of an Armageddon scenario where, to quote a member of our policy committee yesterday, where, potentially neighbourhood plans on parish councils wither on the vine, which isn't what we want to see. But it is a critical kind of crossroads that we're at, isn't it? And I think in addition to that, the use of reserves, a very canny delegate pointed that out in the chat just then. And that's a scenario which we could see with smaller councils.
Can I also mention this is slightly going ever so slightly off topic, but CPRE is doing a lot of work at the moment on energy infrastructure, working with the National Energy System Operator, NESO, on a suite of strategic spatial plans for energy. And we're looking at, we have an expert in our Leicestershire group who used to work for National Grid, and we're trying to put together a model that local councils can use to literally, how does all the stuff at the strategic relate down to the patch I'm working at? So we'll supply further details on that when we've got more information on that. But yeah, it's to try and give parish councils a way into those kind of conversations about strategic spatial energy plans.
Please do plug us into that, because there was we have a recently adopted position on that, and we're engaging. We're hearing more and more case studies, Lancashire, Suffolk, Norfolk, for example, where a lot of public money is potentially being wasted because parish and town councils aren't being consulted. NESO and others, I think, are saying it's not their role to advise on that, but equally, I think parish councils in these areas do feel powerless when decisions appear to have already been made by developers or energy providers as to where they're going to build and how. Our position is on that, is earlier engagement with parish and town councils. Onshore wind farms, offshore wind farms, are just two examples. But yeah, it's strange you mentioned that, because we've got engagement with NESO as well, which we're trying to progress, and it's a live and current issue. Thanks, Jackie. Moving quickly on to David Landon Cole's question. He asks, on the draft guidance and the model design codes, do you know, as a collective, if they'll be going into effect by default if a planning authority doesn't adopt its own, in brackets, I think he means model design codes or draft guidance, or will they just sit there and have no force unless positively adopted? Robbie, that's maybe one for you to start with.
Yeah.
A slightly technical.
Yeah, slightly technical. Potentially, there's been a confusion as well over what I said. So the what was consulted alongside the design chapter was the design and placemaking planning guidance (PPG). Now that sets the framework for all design decisions. But I think the emphasis is that the design codes are undertaken through a local mechanism as well. And I'd say that's another really important way for communities to engage with the planning system is through the preparation of those design codes. And we've done a bit of work around that. For example, how do you engage children and young people best in the planning system? I would argue probably through the design code consultation more than a local plan consultation, which is in itself, vast and difficult, especially for younger children to understand. So I think actually the design coding being a really, really important part of that. So my interpretation at the moment is that, yes, you have quite a strong design guidance framed there in the NPPF, both the chapter and the guidance. And I think one that was actually really well welcomed by the sort of urban design community, and quite a lot of weight on that as well. So the ability to refuse a development if it doesn't meet that. So a lot more weight than given to other chapters. So, I think that's welcomed generally. I think a lot of decisions will hinge on that in particular. I think a great opportunity locally to work on those design codes. I think there's clearly a resource issue there for local authorities taking them forward. There's a slight skills issue there as well. A lot of local authorities don't really have that urban design skill or capacity left in them anymore. So, what's the role of design panels, for example, in supporting that work too? The model conditions, the model planning obligations, and then the validation lists are the ones that have really nationally are going to be brought forward. And, I think that's fine as long as, we make sure we can cover all different local matters sufficiently at that national level. And that could be complex as well. So very much wait to see what we see, devil's in the detail, and work that's still to come from government.
Brilliant. Thanks, Robbie, helping us to make sense of the implications of the NPPF update and the Act on model design codes and draft guidance. I mean, I think it's something which we have been a fan of at NELC, simply because when combined with neighbourhood plans, it can give parish councils more of a say on not just housing allocations, but also the quality of housing, for example, in their local area, which hitherto they haven't really had. So we see that on the Venn diagram with neighbourhood plans as being quite a powerful mechanism. Rick, anything you've picked up on this better planning?
I just wanted to come in. So I mentioned the presumption in favour of development, the sort of what people call the tilted balance sometimes. So that the development, you should try and make sure development is approved as much as you can, including by applying conditions or obligations on developers. So it makes it difficult to oppose development and reject it. But there is a steer in the new draft NPPF towards only certain policies being grounds for overriding the presumption in favour of development, and design is one of those. So if it is not good design, it is grounds for rejecting an application even with the presumption in favour of development. So I think that's quite important, and it's also within the description of what good design looks like in the draft NPPF. There are some elements that are quite useful for other issues. So it does cover transport. So the transport impacts of development are not generally grounds for rejecting development. You can try and shape it to be better, but it's not grounds for rejecting development in the main. However, the inclusion of transport within what good design looks like is a helpful, it's sort of the hook you might be able to use for saying that in this case we don't think this development should go ahead despite the presumption in favour of development.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed. Jackie, any kind of rural implications for?
I think that's it. I think when you look at the use of design codes, we are supportive of new development being master planned, and I think there's the heritage and cultural aspects of it, getting styling of new buildings to be sensitive to where they're situated, and so landscape terms and heritage terms in particular. So there is already the national design model design code, so that's there in the absence of any other, because that is the role of neighbourhood plans, is to give that kind of prescriptive element in terms of local design. So that is why they are of value, and that is why we would say if you can progress a neighbourhood plan, if you've not already got one, it's a worthwhile document to have. I spoke recently with David Rudlin he used to work for Urbed, and he's now a government advisor on new towns, and there are just principles in terms of street widths, heights of buildings, and how that impacts the relationship between new development and space. And of course, CPRE is very big on making sure green spaces connect to people. So where a new development comes forward, make sure there's enough green space in, and people can get through an area on foot and through public transport as well. So those issues are catered for through the design codes. Thank you.
Brilliant. That's really, really helpful to know. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, because as I say, it's been picked up as being a potentially very useful mechanism still for
Not
council.
least Rick's point about it being a useful argument to make the case against, but CPRE is supposed to be promoting more sustainable development rather than stopping it.
We didn't just hear you say that. We won't tell anyone. We promise we won't tell anyone. Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, yeah, Jackie, and all the speakers for that answer. Brilliant. Moving on, got a few minutes left for one or two more questions. I'm trying to get through as many as I can. Anthony Shepherd, I think Anthony posted a couple of questions, but he says he's familiar with the MPPF and PPGs. I'm going to slightly twist your question here, Anthony, because it's basically a good one. I think Anthony's actual question is, but where do we find NDMPs and national spatial strategies? But I'm going to ask that, starting with yourself, Rick, actually, in terms of the NPPF update, how strong you found NDMPs and national spatial strategies in that document as compared with before. NALC's position on NDMPs, if I can get my mouth around it, is that we basically weren't particularly in favour of them because we saw them as a trump card against local plans and neighbourhood plans, certainly under the previous government. But did Better Planning Coalition have a take, or did you observe anything in drafting your response on those?
So I just go back slightly. So NDMPs in the new National Planning Policy Framework. This is sort of to try and keep it simple. It for the first time splits out policies that are designed to influence local plans and the sub-regional spatial development strategies and neighbourhood plans, and then policies on which you make a decision. So the NDMPs are the policies on which you would make decisions. So they were originally going to be statutory ones, as called national decision-making policies, introduced in legislation under the last government. This government has decided to rename them as national decision-making policies. They're not statutory, but they have a lot of force because they're in the National Planning Policy Framework. And if you don't have a local plan, then they apply, and your local plan shouldn't be contrary to what's in the NPPF, and you shouldn't repeat what's in the NPPF in your local plan as well. So they carry a lot of weight. So that the thing that worries me, I guess, is that this is a kind of centralization of planning policy. So like Robbie was saying about kind of, there's always a balance between what you wanting certainty and standardization, and then having flexibility to make something work for a local area. And public policy always fluctuates between the two. So like in the first term of the Blair government, it was all about bringing everyone up to the same standard, minimum standards. And then the second term was supposed to be kind of like letting 1,000 flowers bloom, because actually you want to have more variation, you want to adapt to local circumstances. We're in that centralization stage, and I think that's a bit of a mistake. You want to improve the efficiency of the system, but you need to respond to what's happening locally. I think over time we might get returned to that. So the spatial development strategies that we've mentioned, which are for kind of like, if you like, sort of county level or slightly bigger than county level areas, can be a way of trying to respond to what is needed in that area. And they will be helpful as well, because they should be about how to apportion development in the right places across that whole area. It's difficult for a local authority area to deal with the kind of all the things that's required of it, because it's so small. So it's helpful to have that coordination of the spatial development strategy, is what I would say. I think it also reflects probably a lot of things that the government's doing that are helpful will take time to come in. So there is a more interventionist approach to housing. There is all the money that's going into the social and affordable housing programme to pay for council housing and housing association housing and build that up over time. But in the short term, we've got the release of more land for developments. We've got the grey belt policy, and we've got more speculative developments, I think, going ahead. But at the same time, as developers trying to pull back because of the inflation in their costs and the extra costs that they're facing, and the weak demand there is in the economy for housing, because people can't afford homes because of the weakness of wage rises, basically.
Completely agree, and I certainly didn't know that until today, Rick, what you mentioned about there being a 7% reduction in big developer house building, across the country. I didn't know, but it's not entirely surprising given inflation and overheads affecting most industries. Interesting. Jackie, I guess this is kind of parting shots in terms of like CPRE's take from its NPPF update response on NDMPs. I got it right that time, and national spatial strategies.
I think, well, our campaign has always been, they're coming in, so we've got them, and what we wanted was where local authorities had fought hard and provided evidence at examination for their local plans and got additional benefits. So Lancaster District, it got an addition to its climate change because it was behind, and it said locally, and it provided the justification why it was going to go above what was set out in the NPPF. We feel, well, that's hard earned. It's gone through independent examination. It should stand, but that won't be the case. So we hope the government will allow, in those cases where justification exists, that people can go over and above, and that should be for biodiversity net gain or environmental net gains, maybe for affordable housing. Because obviously across the country there are, say, areas that are popular for tourism, Cornwall, and there are abilities for local authorities to limit the amount of houses that go as second homes. And so there are local differences that do need to be factored into the planning process. And so NDMPs, yes, set the standard. Hopefully it'll bring the level up, but it ought to, as I say, allow for those exceptional cases to go beyond what's required in the NPPF.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Jackie. Robbie, the final word on NDMPs and national spatial strategies.
Well, so it's strategic development strategies, and in fact, it's a national strategy that we've been asking for all these years. So it's great that we've got the sub-regional tier now of planning, and we've asked for that since its abolition in 2011-12. But we actually want a national spatial framework. So we want to see nationally what the ambitions are for this country, so we have a joined up approach. Because at the moment, spatial development strategies are going to be having to do a lot of work, and that's having reference to the land use framework, to the industrial strategy, to the long-term housing strategy, to the national integrated transport strategy, and it goes on and on and on. And we think all these national government sectoral strategies have a spatial element, and that should be aligned in a national spatial framework that should then inform the spatial development strategies. Obviously, we need to get on top of local plans. We need to move closer to full coverage. We'll see if the removal of the kind of more of the written element, and I guess they're going to turn into more allocation machines, whether that will speed them up or not. But we have seen a creep in other workloads for local plans around dealing with and managing development viability, for example, or through now having to allocate small and medium sites, which could be a huge amount of work. And also back to my point about what they do with supplementary planning documents. So whilst government has tried to sort of abridge the local plan preparation process, it's the workloads have crept up elsewhere. And without identifying long-term resourcing for local plan teams, we're never going to have that vision-led approach to planning, which we absolutely need. And yes, we will be subject to speculative development, or Rick, as I've heard called recently, ahead of plan development. So absolutely, let's get to this new plan-led system. Is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. But we need to finance that as a society, because we will reap the benefits over the next 10, 20 years if we get there.
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. Yeah, making sense of some of this to me as well. I'm certainly not a planner, but it's very, very interesting. But again, agree with one or two of the delegates here. A lot of kind of technical terminology, and trying to make sense of it for any level of local government is difficult. But I completely agree with a couple of the strong points you were making there, Robbie, about resource at LPAs, local planning authorities. It's going to be even more important, however resourced, to strengthen even the government's own reforms, which it wants to bring in, because you need planning officers to actually make a lot of this happen, whether or not the power is disappearing from planning committees or not, and they need to make that make sure that they're resourced somehow. So yeah, completely concur with pretty much everything Robbie, Jackie, and Rick have said. Thank you so much for speaking. Absolutely fascinating event to chair. Thank you so much.